Chapter 1. The Forgotten Legend. Atop Zoran Prime, the glittering capital of the Galactic Conclave, the ruling council of the galaxy, the air in the grand meeting chamber felt heavy, as though someone had just dropped a neutron star into the midst of the gathering. The walls, forged from shimmering alloy and etched with depictions of the Conclave's triumphs over millennia, gazed down with their usual arrogance. But today, no one paid them any mind. All eyes were fixed on Prime Chancellor Corin Vikes, the cold and calculating leader of the Zethar Dominion, seated at the head of the table with an expression like he just swallowed an indigestible gemstone. Corin wasn't the type to joke around. With silver eyes glinting and ceremonial armor hugging his frame, he looked more like a living statue than a flesh and blood being. Beside him stood General Zorith Klein of the Dracon Imperium, a towering reptilian figure as still as a mountain, his golden eyes scanning the room as if searching for something to tear apart. His scales gleamed under the light, and each breath he took rasped like an old machine rather than a living creature. The Galactic Conclave was a coalition of species who considered themselves untouchable. They'd crushed rebellions, devoured civilizations, and rewritten history to make everything look pristine on paper, or rather, on holographic data slates. Today, they'd gathered to discuss mundane matters, trade taxes, border disputes, and who got to exploit yet another dead rock on the galaxy's edge. But then, amid the tedious murmurs, an old, worn-out topic surfaced like a rusted ship rising from the ocean floor. Terrans, a tiny delegate from the Zolran species, whispered, his voice trembling as if he'd just uttered a curse. "I heard there were strange signals in the dark space. Could it be them?" The room went quiet for a second before erupting in laughter. Corin smirked, his smile sharp as a freshly honed blade. "Terrans? That old tale again? I thought we'd agreed it's just a drunken spacer's yarn from 1,000 years ago." Zorith growled, the sound rumbling from deep in his throat. "Whether those stories are true or not doesn't matter. There's no proof, no wreckage, nothing but the whispers of senile scholars digging through historical trash. Indeed, Terrans, or humans, as some called them, were a legend even galactic children no longer believed in. They were said to be a species from a small blue planet called Terra, lost somewhere in the galaxy's forgotten reaches. Tales spoke of them as unpredictable warriors who turned adversity into strength, striking fear into even the oldest empires. But no evidence had ever surfaced. Not a shard of a ship, not a trace of genetic code, not a single official record in the Conclave's vast data vaults confirmed their existence. They were probably just a figment of imagination, a fairy tale to scare the faint-hearted, probably some smugglers spinning yarns to jack up their prices. Corin said, his voice as dry as Zoran Prime's deserts. "They know we love a good thriller to spice up these meetings." The crowd laughed louder, but the mirth died abruptly when the central hologram door flared to life. An emergency signal cut through the chatter, and the panicked voice of Captain Jin Ralthar, commander of the scout ship Ecliptor, blared over the speakers. "Conclave, this is Ecliptor, from the edge of explored space. We've detected something. A fleet. No, nothing like we've ever seen. It's massive, armed to the teeth, and moving like they know exactly where we are." Corin frowned, his grip tightening on his chair's armrests. "Ralthar, calm down. Who is it? Pirates or some old enemy playing dress-up?" Jin's voice shook, nearly breaking. "No, Chancellor, we analyzed the signals and visuals. The ships, they bear strange markings. But the system matched them to forbidden ancient records. It's the Terrans." The room went dead silent. A few delegates chuckled nervously. The kind of laugh you give when you don't know how to react. Corin shot to his feet, his silver eyes flashing. "Terrans? Are you saying ghosts from old books are piloting warships out there? Ralthar, are you sure you're not still drunk from your last shift?" But before Jin could reply, the chamber's central screen flickered. A blurry image appeared, beamed live from Ecliptor. It was a fleet. No, calling it a fleet was an understatement. Hundreds of colossal ships, black as the void of a black hole, glided through space with terrifying precision. They emitted no light, reflected no radar signals, as if designed to meld into the darkness. And on the largest ship's hull, a red and white emblem stood out, United Terran Alliance, UTA. Zorith stepped forward, his claws scraping the metal floor. What is this? Some kind of prank? Did someone forget to turn off the 3D projector? But no one laughed this time. A technician in the corner, hands trembling over his console, whispered, "The data shows their speed, it's beyond anything we know. It could be an Alcubierre drive, warping space-time. No species in the Conclave has this tech." Corrin spun around, his voice cutting like a blade. "Terrans are a myth. They're not real. This has to be a trick. Maybe those Theta Sector rebels pulling a stunt." But Jin, from the other end of the signal, screamed before the transmission cut off, "You don't understand. They're real, and they're coming." The screen went black, leaving the Conclave in suffocating silence. Zorith tilted his head, his golden eyes narrowing. "If this is real, we've just woken something we can't control." Corrin clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms until they drew blood. He didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. Terrans were a fairy tale, a whisper in the dark, a joke even the drunkest spacers had stopped telling. But if Jin was right, if those ships were truly human, then what? What did they want? And more importantly, what had they been doing for the thousands of years the Conclave thought them gone? The chamber remained silent, but fear had begun to creep into every shadowed corner. Legends, it turned out, might not just be stories. Chapter 2. The Fleet from the Shadows. The meeting chamber on Zoran Prime hadn't yet recovered from the shock of Ecliptor's transmission. The central screen, now a static gray void, seemed to mock the Galactic Conclave's arrogance. Prime Chancellor Corrin Vikes stood frozen, his silver eyes locked on the emptiness where the Terran fleet had just appeared. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, a rare sight for a man who always maintained an icy demeanor. Beside him, General Zorith Klein growled, his claws raking across the meeting table, leaving deep gouges in the metal surface. "Bring that image back," Corrin barked, his voice echoing like a detonation in the confined space. "I want to see exactly what they are, or rather, what they're pretending to be." A young technician, his face pale as if he'd just seen his ancestors' ghosts, fumbled with the controls. "Sir, the signal from Ecliptor is completely gone. But we saved a final data burst before the connection died." The screen flickered, and the image of the Terran fleet reappeared, sharper than before. The massive ships glided through space like specters, their pitch-black hulls swallowing all light. They bore no resemblance to any design the Conclave knew, no elegant curves of Dracon vessels or angular precision of Zethar warships. Instead, they were pure war machines, thick plating studded with weapons, turrets glinting with cold metal, and on the largest ship's side, the red and white emblem, United Terran Alliance, UTA, stood out like a declaration carved in stone. Zorith tilted his head, his golden eyes narrowing. "If this is a joke, whoever's behind it deserves a medal for creativity. But if it's not, what are we looking at?" Before Corrin could respond, a new voice cut through the silence, not Jin Ralthar's, but a female voice, deep and cold as the depths of space. "Galactic Conclave." It sliced through the quiet like a blade. "We're what you tried to erase. We've returned to reclaim what is ours." The screen shifted, and a face appeared. It was Admiral Mira Solon, commander of the Terran fleet. Her black hair was tied tightly back, her piercing blue eyes radiating unwavering resolve. Her uniform bore unfamiliar insignia. But what chilled the room was the absolute calm on her face, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Corrin laughed, but the sound was dry and lifeless. "Reclaim what? A fairy tale that never existed? Who are you, and what is this farce?" Mira didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head, as if assessing whether Corrin was worth a reply. Then she spoke, her voice even and deliberate. "You called us a legend. You were wrong, and that mistake will cost you." The transmission ended, leaving the conclave in chaos. Delegates began shouting, pointing fingers as if someone in the room had to be responsible. Corrin slammed his hand on the table, rattling the chamber. "Enough, Zorith. Check the data. I want to know what we're dealing with, real or fake." Zorith nodded, gesturing to the tech team. A hologram of the largest Terran ship materialized in the room's center. The technicians began their analysis, and what they found made the air heavier than ever. "General," one technician stammered, "these markings, They match forbidden records in the ancient archives. Documents the Conclave ordered destroyed millennia ago. The language on the ships, it's a variant of something called Latin. A dead tongue from the galaxy's early days. Corran frowned. Latin? What are you saying? This is a hoax, isn't it? But Zorith leaned forward, his claws gripping the table's edge. Not so simple, Corran. If this is a forgery, whoever made it knows too much. These symbols aren't something just anyone could replicate. And look at how they move, no fluctuations. No energy waste. This is tech beyond us. A different perspective flickered into focus. Light years away on the command deck of Elysium, the Terran flagship, Admiral Mira Solon stood before a small hologram of old Earth, a vibrant blue sphere swirled with white clouds. Her hands gripped the console, nails digging into the metal. They burned our home, she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse. They thought we'd forget, but we didn't forget, and we don't forgive. Back on Zoran Prime, a technician shouted, I've got sensor data. This fleet has at least 400 capital-class warships, but the readings suggest more. Beyond our scanning range, this might just be their vanguard. Corran whipped around, his eyes flashing with rare panic. 400? Impossible. No species in this galaxy could hide a fleet that size undetected. Zorith growled, his voice dropping to a rumble. Unless they weren't in this galaxy. Unless they fled, and came back. The room fell silent. The idea that Terrans, the humans of legend, could have not only survived but thrived in the shadows for millennia was unthinkable. Corran shook his head, trying to cling to his crumbling confidence. If this is real, what do they want? Revenge? Territory? Or just a show of force? Zorith looked at him, his golden eyes glinting with doubt. Whatever it is, we're not ready. I suggest activating the Grand Coalition fleet immediately. If they get closer, we need to stop them before they reach Zoran Prime. Corran nodded, though a cold dread spread through him. Do it, and pray this is just a nightmare we'll wake up from. But deep in his mind, an unspoken question lingered. If you were Corran, what would you do when faced with an enemy you thought existed only in old books? Surrender? Fight? Or run? He had no answer, and as the Terran fleet drew nearer, time to find one was running out. On Elysium, Mira Solon gazed into the void ahead, her eyes burning with an unquenchable fire. They'll remember who we are, she whispered, whether they want to or not. Chapter 3. The First Clash. At the Clethera Border Defense Station, hundreds of light years from Zoran Prime, the atmosphere was taut as a bowstring ready to snap. Clethera was a colossal space fortress, one of the Galactic Conclave's mightiest outposts, bristling with plasma cannons, dense energy shields, and a crew of elite warriors who prided themselves on never letting an enemy pass. General Vaxon Ride, the station's commander, stood on the control deck, his muscular arms crossed, his red eyes glaring at the radar screen. A grizzled Valthor warrior, he wore gleaming silver armor, and his voice boomed like clashing metal. Terrans? Vaxon muttered, a sneer curling his lip as he received the alert from Zoran Prime. I'd bet my last plasma cord this is just some cosmic pirates dressing up as legends to scare the desk jockeys. They'll be ash before they even scratch our shields. But as the radar screen began to blink, Vaxon's smirk vanished. Hundreds of red dots appeared. Then thousands, moving with speed and precision that defied belief. A young officer, his face drained of color, shouted, General, they're in scanning range, at least 400 capital ships. And more are popping up. Vaxon tilted his head, his voice dropping. 400? Are we facing an entire empire out there? Get me visuals. The main screen flared to life, and what appeared silenced the entire control deck. The Terran fleet emerged from the darkness of space like a pack of monstrous predators. Black ships, their hulls thick as a dead planet's crust, glided forward silently, their weapons, long turrets, glinting launch tubes, looked designed to shred anything in their path. And on the lead ship's hull, the red and white, United Terran Alliance, emblem blazed like a war cry etched in light. They're right in front of us, a technician whispered, his trembling hands hovering over the controls. Distance is down to 50.000 kilometers. They came too fast. Vaxon roared, activate all shields, charge the plasma cannons, If they want a fight, Clethera will show them the price of stepping into Conclave territory. Before the crew could fully respond, a signal came through from the Terran fleet. Admiral Mira Solan's voice rang out, cold and sharp as a blade cutting through space. Clethera Station. This is the United Terran Alliance. Surrender, or be erased. You have 60 seconds to decide. Vaxon laughed, the harsh sound echoing across the deck. Surrender? Who does she think she is? Giving me orders? This is Conclave ground. You imposter. I'll turn you into scrap before she can finish counting. He spun to the gunnery team. Target the biggest ship. Fire the moment they're in range. But Mira didn't count down. The signal cut off, and the Terran fleet acted. From the lead ship, Elysium, a barrage of glowing projectiles erupted. Not plasma or lasers but kinetic penetrators. Hurtling at thousands of kilometers per second, they slammed into Clethera's energy shields. And something unthinkable happened. The shields shattered like glass under a hammer. What's happening? Vaxon bellowed, slamming his fist onto the console. Our shields are built to stop asteroids. A technician, drenched in sweat, stammered, it's railguns, sir. Electromagnetic accelerators. Their rounds are too fast. Too powerful. The shields can't regenerate in time. Before Vaxon could process it, a second wave struck. Small missiles launched from the Terran fleet. But they didn't detonate on impact. Instead, they emitted jamming signals, hacking straight into Clethera's AI systems. The control screens flickered chaotically. Plasma cannons shut down automatically. And alarms blared like a symphony of despair. Fire manually. Shoot by hand. Vaxon roared. But it was too late. A salvo of plasma lances from Elysium tore through. Searing beams of green energy slicing the station like a hot knife through butter. Explosions rocked the structure, ripping apart meter-thick metal plating. In less than 3 minutes, Clethera, the Conclave's invincible fortress, became a drifting wreck in space. The live feed from Clethera streamed back to Zoran Prime, and the Galactic Conclave watched it all unfold. Prime Chancellor Corin Vikes sank into his chair, his silver eyes wide with horror. General Zorith Klein clenched his jaw, his claws digging into the table until the metal buckled. No one spoke, but the sounds of Clethera's destruction echoed through the speakers. A grim reminder that this enemy wasn't playing games. Clethera, it's gone, a delegate whispered, his voice breaking. In minutes. How? Corin turned to Zorith, his voice trembling despite his efforts to hide it. What are we facing here? A pirate fleet couldn't do this. No one could. Zorith stared at the screen, where Clethera's debris floated among the stars. That's not pirates, he said, his voice a low rumble. That's war, and we know nothing about this enemy. A technician in the corner, hands still shaking over his console, added, their weapons. Those railguns can fire at 10.000 meters per second. No shield in the galaxy can take that. And that AI system, they hacked us like kids playing with toys. Corin slammed his hand on the table, rattling the room. I don't care what they're using. We're the Conclave. We have the Grand Coalition fleet, thousands of ships, millions of soldiers. Order them to muster now. I want these things crushed before they take another step. Zorith nodded, but his golden eyes glinted with doubt. I'll do it, but Corin, if this is just their vanguard, we haven't seen their full strength. The chamber fell silent, Corin's heavy breathing the only sound. He wanted to believe the Conclave could smash this threat, that it was just a fleeting nightmare. But deep down, he knew. The Terrans hadn't come to play at war. They'd come to end it. On Elysium, Mira Solan stood before the observation window, watching Clethera's wreckage drift by. A young officer approached, his voice hesitant. Admiral, they didn't surrender. Should we send another message? Mira shook her head, her blue eyes never leaving the void. No need. They'll understand through actions. Prepare for the next step. This galaxy will remember the fear they forgot. Chapter 4. Secrets Exposed. The meeting chamber on Zoran Prime was no longer a symbol of unassailable power. The once glorious alloy walls seemed to shrink under the weight of fear creeping through the room. Prime Chancellor Corin Vikes slumped in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. Before him, the central screen replayed the final moments of Clethera, twisted metal fragments drifting in space. glinting like dead stars. General Zorith Klein stood motionless, his golden eyes fixed on the wreckage, as if searching for an explanation amid the chaos. What happened to Clethera? A small Salrin delegate whispered, his voice trembling like wind through an empty corridor. No one could destroy a fortress like that in minutes. No one. Corrin spun around, his silver eyes flashing with fury. Shut up. We don't need more panic. Zorith, say something. What do we do about these Terrans? Zorith growled, his claws scraping the meeting table, adding another deep scratch. Do what? We don't know who they are, how many ships they have, or what they want, but one thing's clear. They're not here to negotiate. Before Corrin could argue, a slight figure stepped from the room's shadows. Lyra Voon, a timid Elithar scholar, clutched an ancient data device, her hands trembling, her silver-white fur quivered as if caught in a breeze, and her large, round eyes gleamed with a mix of fear and determination. Sir, Prime Chancellor, she stammered, I can explain, but you won't like it. Corrin scowled, his voice sharp as a blade. Explain? Who are you to interrupt now? Speak fast, or get out. Lyra swallowed hard, stepping to the room's center, and activated the device. A hazy hologram flickered to life, displaying ancient text and faded images of ravaged planets. I'm a historian from the Elithar Institute, she said, her voice steadying. I found forbidden records, ones the Conclave ordered destroyed millennia ago. They're about the Terrans. The room fell deathly silent. Zorith tilted his head, his golden eyes narrowing. Forbidden records? What do you mean? Lyra took a deep breath and pressed on. The Terrans weren't a myth. They were a real civilization. From a planet called Terra. Thousands of years ago, they challenged the first Conclave, our predecessors, and nearly won. But the Conclave struck back. They burned the Terran colonies, wiped out billions, and seized their planets, worlds that now belong to the Conclave's greatest members. The hologram shifted, showing cities ablaze under orbital bombardments, Terran ships fleeing desperately into the void. An ancient recording crackled through, its voice low and cold. Erase all traces of the Terrans. Never speak of them again. Corrin slammed his hand on the table, making the hologram shudder. Lies. If they were that strong, where's the proof? Why doesn't anyone know? Lyra flinched but continued, because the Conclave erased them from history. They called it the Purge Campaign. But not all died. Some escaped, millions, in massive ships, fleeing to the dark space beyond our reach. They didn't vanish. They survived. The room erupted in shouts. Nonsense. One delegate roared. Enemy propaganda. Another cried. But Zorith raised a hand, silencing them. His eyes locked on Lyra. Go on, he said, his voice a low rumble. Lyra nodded, activating another image. A galactic map dotted with red points. Terran worlds now claimed by the Zethar Dominion, Dracon Imperium, and others. They lost everything, she said, but now they're back, and I think they want it back. Before anyone could respond, a new signal interrupted, broadcasting across every Conclave channel, not just in the chamber, but galaxy-wide. Admiral Mira Solan's voice rang out, cold and unrelenting. Galactic Conclave, you built your empire on our blood and bones. You thought us a myth. But we are the truth. And this truth will expose your crimes. The screen shifted to Lyra's archive footage, bombs falling, Terran cities crumbling, screams drowned in fire. It beamed out to every planet, from Zoran Prime to the farthest colonies. Populations across hundreds of worlds watched, and whispers began to spread. The Conclave lied to us. On Elysium, light years away, a young Terran soldier named Kale Draven stood beside Admiral Mira, staring at the broadcast screen. He gripped his rifle tightly, his brown eyes blazing with inherited memory. My grandmother told me about the day they burned Terra Nova, he said, his voice rough. She said we must never forget. We learned to burn brighter than their flames. Mira turned, her blue eyes meeting Kale's. We don't just burn bright, she said, we'll incinerate their lies. Back on Zoran Prime, Corrin leapt up, his hands shaking. Turn it off, he screamed. But no one listened. On the streets below, crowds gathered, staring at the sky, murmuring about the Terrans. Some shouted for answers, while others quietly wondered, if this is true, What has the Conclave done to us? Zorith turned to Corrin, his voice dropping low. If she's right, we're not just facing a fleet. We're facing an accusation, and the whole galaxy is listening. Corrin gritted his teeth, clinging to his unraveling control. They can't prove anything. This is propaganda to weaken us. But Lyra, still standing with her device, whispered, they don't need to prove it. The truth was there, buried by us, and now it's free. A question hung unspoken in the air. What would you think if your own history was erased just so others could sit on your throne? Corrin had no answer, but he knew one thing. The Conclave's power was faltering, and the Terran fleet was still coming. Chapter 5. The Fall of an Empire. Zoran Prime, the proud heart of the Galactic Conclave, had never known panic like this. The glittering streets, once illuminated by towering hologram lamps, now lay dark as citizens spilled out, staring upward with eyes full of fear and curiosity. News of Clethera's fall and Admiral Mirasolan's galaxy-wide broadcast had spread like wildfire through dry grass, shaking the Conclave's foundations. Inside the central meeting chamber, Prime Chancellor Corrin Vikes was on the verge of madness, his hands pounding the table relentlessly, rattling the room. We have to do something, Corrin shouted, his voice cracking between rage and desperation. They can't reach here. They can't reach Zoran Prime. Zorith, where's our fleet? General Zorith Klein stood still, his golden eyes fixed on the holographic map in the room's center. Green dots representing the Grand Coalition fleet, the Conclave's pride, were mustering at the system's edge. But they looked pitifully small against the sprawling red swarm of the Terran fleet. They're coming, Zorith said, his voice a low toll of doom. Faster than we thought. Before Corrin could reply, an officer burst in, his face pale as if he'd glimpsed the end of days. Sirs, the Terran fleet, they've jumped FTL. They didn't fight through our defenses, they went straight into the central system. They're here. The room froze. Corrin spun around, his silver eyes wide. FTL jump? What do you mean? No one can jump through warp space undetected. The officer stammered. They used something. We think it's wormhole manipulation tech, beyond anything we understand. The main screen flared to life, and the image that appeared chilled every soul in the room. The Terran fleet materialized in Zoran Prime's orbit, thousands of black ships filling the sky like a storm of steel. From massive warships like Elysium to swarms of smaller attack craft, they moved with terrifying precision, encircling the planet in minutes. Not a single shot was fired, yet, but their presence was a declaration of war without words. Mirasolan's voice rang out across all channels, cold and uncompromising. Galactic Conclave, your time is up. We didn't come to rule. We came to end you. Corrin leapt up, screaming at the screen as if Mira could hear him. You have no right. This is Zoran Prime, the galaxy's core. We'll crush you. But Zorith grabbed his shoulder, claws digging in. Corrin, look, we don't stand a chance. They've bypassed every defense like it wasn't even there. In orbit, the Grand Coalition fleet mounted a desperate counterattack. Thousands of Conclave ships charged into battle, plasma cannons blazing, missiles roaring through space. For a fleeting moment, it seemed they might hold. Shields flared brightly under the Terran's initial salvo. But then Mira gave the order, and the Terran fleet unleashed its reply. From Elysium, massive railguns fired, launching kinetic penetrators at horrifying speeds, tearing through Conclave shields like wet paper. AI-guided missiles streaked out, hacking into enemy control systems, turning ships against each other. A colossal Dracon warship exploded in seconds, dragging dozens of smaller vessels into a chain reaction blast. The Conclave fleet disintegrated before the Conclave's eyes, and the screams of commanders echoed through the speakers before the signals went dead. Corrin collapsed into his chair, hands covering his face. Impossible. We're the Conclave. We're untouchable. Zorith growled, but his voice had lost its arrogance. Untouchable? We just lost our fleet in under 10 minutes. We're done. A final transmission from Mira came through, this time directed solely at the chamber. Her face appeared on the screen, her blue eyes burning with unshakable resolve. Corrin Vikes, Zorith Klein, and all of you. We offer one last chance. Surrender. Or die. Choose. Corrin trembled, his voice hoarse as he stood. We We surrender. The Galactic Conclave surrenders to the United Terran Alliance. Spare us. We'll do anything. The room fell silent, awaiting her response. Mira tilted her head, her eyes unyielding. Surrender? She let the word hang in the air. A blade yet to fall. You think this ends with surrender? Corrin stammered. We admit our wrongs. The past was our ancestors' mistake. Let us make amends. Mira leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper of death. There is no us. There's no amends. You built an empire on our blood. And now you'll pay for it. The screen went dark, and instantly, Zoran Prime's sky shook. The Terran fleet sprang into action. Warships unleashed thousands of drop pods, raining down like a steel storm. Terran soldiers in glossy black armor landed everywhere, from the central plaza to government halls. They didn't shout, didn't claim victory. They acted, with the cold precision of machines forged over millennia. In the chamber, Corrin screamed, "Defend the center, call the guards." But the doors burst open, and Terran troops stormed in. Zorith lunged, claws slashing, but a plasma bolt pierced his chest, dropping him in a heap. Corrin stumbled back, raising his hands in plea. Don't, I'm the Chancellor. I can negotiate. A Terran soldier, face hidden behind a visor, stepped forward. No negotiations, he said, voice flat. A flash of light, and Corrin fell, his silver eyes wide in final terror. Outside, across Zoran Prime, the same scene unfolded. Conclave leaders were hunted down and eliminated. No mercy. No hesitation. Noble families, who'd profited from the Terrans' destruction millennia ago, were dragged from mansions to face their fate. The populace watched, some in terror, some nodding quietly as if justice had finally arrived. On Elysium, Mira Solon observed through the window. Arms crossed. An officer approached, voice hesitant. Admiral, we've secured Zoran Prime. The Conclave is no more. Next orders? Mira turned, her eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. Finish it. Let the galaxy see the cost of forgetting us. A question lingered silently in the minds of the survivors. If an enemy this powerful existed, why did we ever dare erase them from history? But now, no one had time to answer. Chapter 6. The Legacy of Humanity. Zoran Prime now stood as a tableau of eerie stillness. The streets, once ablaze with holographic splendor, lay coated in dust and debris, but the sky was no longer shadowed by the Terran fleet's ominous black hulls. Mere hours after the Galactic Conclave's collapse, the ships of the United Terran Alliance began their withdrawal, as silent as they had arrived. No cheers of triumph, no banners raised, just silence, a heavy, resonant silence, as if the galaxy had exhaled after millennia of holding its breath. On the command deck of Elysium, Admiral Mira Solon stood before the observation window, her blue eyes gazing down at the newly freed planet. Her black uniform remained crisp, not a crease in sight, but her hands, now relaxed at her sides, trembled faintly, not from fear, but from an emotion she couldn't name. Beside her, Kale Draven, the young soldier who'd spoken of his grandmother's tales, followed her gaze, his hand still gripping his rifle as if unready to let go. We did it, Admiral, Kale said, his voice rough but brimming with pride. The Conclave's finished. They can't erase us again. Mira turned, her blue eyes meeting Kale's burning brown ones. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward, a rare hint of relief. Victory isn't about revenge, Kale, she said, her voice low like waves lapping ashore. It's about making them remember who we are, and ensuring they never forget again. She stepped to the console, activating a final broadcast to the galaxy. Her image appeared on every functioning screen, from Zoran Prime to the most distant colonies. We are the United Terran Alliance, she declared, her voice clear and unwavering. We've reclaimed our honor, not your thrones. The galaxy is yours now. Decide its future for yourselves. The signal cut off, and the Terran fleet began to depart. The black ships jumped FTL, vanishing into the deep void, leaving Zoran Prime and hundreds of worlds in a mix of chaos and hope. They didn't occupy, didn't impose laws. They destroyed those who'd once erased them, then walked away, like a fierce wind sweeping through, leaving permanent change in its wake. On Zoran Prime, Crowds gathered around the ruins of the conclave's center. Some wept for what was lost, but many whispered of the Terrans with awe. A group of technicians sifted through the debris, seeking traces of the advanced tech the fleet had left behind. One, a young Zolran engineer, picked up a black metal shard, a piece of a Terran hull, and murmured. They were so strong, but they didn't stay. Why? The answer came in the weeks that followed. From other worlds, species once oppressed by the Conclave, from the diminutive Salrin to the proud Dracon, began searching for Terran remnants. Some sent scout ships into dark space, hoping to find where humanity had hidden for millennia. Others studied the wreckage, eager to learn from their technology. But all agreed on one thing. The Terrans weren't just destroyers. They were a symbol of resilience, of surviving the unimaginable. Far from Zoran Prime, on a small planet called Kethra at the galaxy's edge, an Elithar child sat on dry grasslands, tiny hands clutching a fragment of a Terran drop pod. The metal glinted in its eyes, and it looked up at the star-filled sky. Someday, the child whispered, I'll find them. I want to know who they are. Its mother, standing a few steps away, smiled sadly. They're the ones who gave us freedom. Little one, she said, but they're also the ones we must never forget. On Elysium, Mira sat alone in the command room, a hologram of old Earth flickering before her. The blue planet was long gone, but its memory lived in every Terran, through stories, through generations hidden in the dark, through ships forged from patience and silent fury. She touched the hologram, her fingers passing through the faint light, and whispered, We did it, Terra, we made them remember. She stood, switched off the hologram, and left the room. The Terran fleet faded into dark space, leaving no trace beyond the tales beginning to spread. But one thing was clear to all. Humanity had returned. And though they didn't rule the galaxy, they'd changed it forever. Across the worlds, whispers grew into new legends. Poets wrote of the fleet from the shadows. Warriors spoke of the Terrans' unstoppable might. And scholars debated the meaning of their return. Some called it justice, others punishment, but all agreed. This time, the Terrans wouldn't be erased from history. A question lingered silently in the minds of those who'd witnessed it. If humanity returned like this, would you feel pride or fear? There was no universal answer, but each world began seeking its own. Some chose to rebuild, learning from the past. Others gazed at the stars, wondering if the Terrans would ever come back. But in the darkness of deep space, Mira Solon and her fleet cared little for those questions. They'd fulfilled their mission, not to conquer, but to remind. The galaxy was free for the first time in millennia, and humanity's legacy lay not in thrones or empires, but in the stars now shining brighter than ever. As Elysium vanished into the void, a shooting star streaked across Kethra's sky, and the Elithar child smiled. Someday, it repeated, I'll find them. And perhaps, somewhere in the shadows, the Terrans were listening.